You have been holding something up for a long time. Not dramatically, not in any way that would be visible to someone passing you on the street. Simply the quiet, continuous effort of a person who has been keeping things together, keeping things moving, keeping things from falling, for longer than they can clearly remember. You may have arrived here tonight not with grief or worry so much as with a particular kind of tiredness that goes deeper than the body. A tiredness that sleep does not always touch. The tiredness of someone who has been strong for a very long time and is not entirely sure they remember how to stop. You are not alone in this. Before we begin, leave one word in the comments tonight. One word for what tired means to you right now. Not the surface tired, the deeper one. Spent, hollow, done, empty, carried. Whatever word is honest, someone else will arrive here carrying the same word and feel less alone for finding it. If this channel is finding you something worth keeping, the subscribe button is there. It costs nothing. It means a night like this one will find you again. Now, close your eyes, if they are ready. Tonight's stories come from 6 traditions and 8 centuries, drawn from corners of the Buddhist world rarely heard in English. A Japanese abbot who held an entire monastery together for 30 years and learned, in his final season, what holding had cost him. A Tibetan woman who carried her teacher's lineage alone through a period when carrying it meant risking everything, and discovered that the carrying had always been lighter than she believed. A Chinese scholar who worked without rest for 40 years and found, on the morning he stopped, that what he had been working toward had been present the entire time. A Korean monk who became so exhausted in practice that his body stopped cooperating, and received from that stopping the teaching he had not been able to receive from the effort. A Sri Lankan laywoman who nursed her entire village through a long illness and collapsed at the end of it, and was told something in the stillness of her collapse that changed everything. And a Burmese abbot, very old, who sat in his garden one evening unable to rise, and understood in that inability the nature of rest that all his years of teaching had pointed toward, but never quite reached. These stories are contemplative in nature, offered here for rest and reflection, not as medical or therapeutic advice. Simply stories. Simply this. Feel where your body meets whatever is beneath it right now. Feel the particular weight of it. Not heavy in a difficult way. Simply present, real. The weight of a body that has been working. Let the working be finished for tonight. The stories are waiting. In the mountains of Echizen province on the western coast of Japan, in the middle years of the Muromachi period, in the 14th century, there was a Soto Zen monastery called Eihoji, which is sometimes translated as the Temple of Eternal Dharma, though the monks who lived and worked there in that period would have been more likely to describe it as the temple where the winter wind came through the north corridor, regardless of how many times the gaps in the wooden screen were repaired. The monastery sat on the lower slope of a cedar-covered mountain, above a river valley that narrowed as it rose into the higher peaks. The river itself was visible from the eastern garden, a gray line in most seasons, fast and pale in spring, slower and darker in autumn, the sound of it audible in the meditation hall at night when the wind was still. A monk named Jozan had been the abbot of Eihoji for 31 years when this story finds him. He had come to the monastery at 22, carrying the education of a minor noble family's son who had decided that the life his education was preparing him for was not the life he intended to live. He had practiced with the particular seriousness of someone who came late to commitment, and therefore brought to it the full weight of a deliberate choice. By his mid-30s, he had received Dharma transmission from his teacher, and had been entrusted with the running of the community. He was, by all accounts that the period preserves, a good abbot. Good in the specific and unglamorous sense. He managed the monastery's relationship with the lay community in the valley below, with the patient consistency that such relationships require. He maintained the buildings as well as limited resources allowed. He held the community's practice schedule through periods of political instability that interrupted other monasteries in the region. He resolved the small conflicts between monks that any community of human beings in close proximity generates continuously, and which, if unaddressed, grow into the larger conflicts that hollow communities from the inside. He did all of this for 31 years. He rose before the bell each morning. He attended every formal practice session. He received every monk who came to him with a question or a difficulty or a complaint that needed to be addressed. He ate last when food was short and rose earliest when there was work to be done. He was the kind of leader whose leadership is most visible in what does not happen, in the crises that never develop because someone was quietly attending to the conditions that produce crises. He did not complain about any of this. He had taken the role willingly. He believed in the work. But there was a quality in him, in his final years, that those who knew him well began to notice without being quite able to name. A quality that was not unhappiness, not dissatisfaction, not loss of faith, something subtler. The particular quality of a person who has been giving continuously for a very long time and has lost the ability to distinguish between what they are giving and what they are. He was 63 years old. He had been giving since 32. The giving had become his entire interior landscape. There was nothing in him that was not organized around the next task, the next need, the next person who required something. He could not remember the last time he had simply sat. Not the formal sitting of the meditation hall, which was also a form of work, of maintaining the schedule, of being present for the community. Simply sat, with no purpose, with no one requiring anything, with the specific quality of rest that is not recovery for the sake of further effort, but rest that is complete in itself. In the late autumn of his 63rd year, he became ill. Not dangerously. A cold that settled in his chest and would not move, the particular, persistent kind that the mountain winters of Exhaustion produced in elderly monks with some regularity. His senior student insisted that he rest. The community would manage. He was to stay in his room. He stayed in his room for 10 days. The first 3 days were almost intolerable. Not because of the illness, which was not severe, because of the absence of purpose. He lay on his sleeping mat, listening to the monastery function without him. The bell rang. The monks assembled. The work periods proceeded. The kitchen prepared the meals. The evening sitting happened. All of it proceeded exactly as it always had, without him. He had believed, without fully knowing he believed it, that the monastery required his continuous attention to remain itself, that the 31 years of his vigilance were what held it together, that if he stopped, something would become undone. On the 4th day, lying in the dim room with the autumn light thin through the paper screen, he understood something. The monastery did not need him. It had never needed him in the way he had organized his entire interior life around the assumption that it did. It had needed someone, yes, attention, care, consistency. But those things were expressions of something that had existed in the tradition long before he arrived and would continue long after he was gone. He had not been holding the monastery up. The monastery had been holding him, the same way it held every monk who had ever lived inside it, offering a structure within which the essential work could happen without each person having to construct that structure anew each day. He had confused being held with holding. He stayed in his room for 10 days. He rested in the specific way that only becomes possible when the internal permission to rest is finally given. Not the rest of someone recovering to return to effort, but the rest of someone who has understood, at last, that effort and rest are not opposites. When he emerged on the 11th day, those who saw him said he looked different. Not better in the way of someone recovered from illness, different in the way of someone who had set something down that they had been carrying for 31 years and had discovered, in the setting down, that their hands were not empty. The teaching from his 10 days in the room is precise. You have been holding things up, real things, things that needed holding. The holding has been real, and it has mattered. And underneath the holding, underneath the years of effort and vigilance and giving, something has been present that never needed the holding to sustain it. That something is resting tonight, regardless of what you do. It does not require your effort to continue. It was present before the first effort you ever made, and will remain after the last. Let your shoulders drop now, just slightly. Let the Abbot's 10 days settle into your chest. The monastery is managing. It always has been. And as the autumn light thins through the paper screen of Jozan's room in the cedar mountains of Exhaustion, we travel now westward and southward across the centuries, to the high plateau of Tibet, where a woman carried an entire lineage alone and discovered the weight was never what she had believed. In the province of Kham in eastern Tibet, in the late 15th century, in a period when the transmission of certain Kagyu lineage teachings had become politically complicated in ways that the teachers of that period navigated with the particular combination of care and courage that complicated times require, there was a woman named Pema Yangchen who held a transmission that her teacher had given her because she was the only student he was certain would not let it disappear. She was 34 years old when her teacher died. She had been his student since she was 19. The transmission she held was not a collection of texts. Texts could be hidden, copied, sent with trusted travelers to distant monasteries. What she held was the living practice itself, the specific sequence of visualizations and their associated instructions that the Nyingma tradition calls terma, hidden treasure, meaning not that it was buried in the earth, but that it was held inside a practitioner whose capacity to carry it authentically had been tested and confirmed. Her teacher had said to her, in the last weeks of his life, when it was clear that the illness would not reverse itself, you are the lineage now. Not part of it, not a keeper of it, the lineage itself. Until you find someone capable of receiving it, it lives only in you. She understood what this meant. It meant that she could not become ill in any way that might affect her memory. It meant that she could not travel to certain regions where the political situation made her presence as a Nyingma practitioner dangerous. It meant that she practiced each day with the specific quality of attention that a person brings to something they are the sole custodian of, which is a very particular and very tiring quality of attention. She practiced for 12 years alone. Not entirely alone. She had a small household, a younger sister whose family provided the practical structure that allowed her to practice without also managing the material requirements of staying alive. There were students, occasionally, people who came to her for teachings within the range of what she was able to offer without transmitting what she was holding in reserve. But the core of what she was doing, the daily maintenance of the transmission in its full integrity, she did alone. The weight of this was not dramatic. It was the quiet, continuous weight of responsibility that cannot be set down. The kind that follows you into sleep and is present again before you have fully assembled yourself in the morning. She did not think of it as a burden exactly. She had chosen it, insofar as a person chooses what their teacher identifies in them and asks of them. She believed in it. But there were mornings in the 7th and 8th year when the weight was simply present in a way she could not fully account for or address. She would sit to practice, and the practice would be there, complete, intact, everything her teacher had given her alive and accessible. And underneath the practice, also present, a tiredness that the practice did not touch. She had been strong for 8 years, strong in the specific way that holding something requires strength. And she did not know how to stop being strong, because stopping meant setting down what could not be set down. In the 9th year, a student came who had the capacity. She recognized it within the first week of his presence, the specific quality of attention that her teacher had described to her, the mind that can receive without losing its shape, that is porous enough to absorb and stable enough not to dissolve. She tested him carefully over 3 months, as her teacher had taught her to test. He was ready. The transmission took 7 days. On the 8th morning after the transmission was complete, she sat in her practice room as she had sat every morning for 12 years. The same room, the same light through the same window, the same posture. And the weight was gone, not the practice. The practice was still present, still available, still hers, but the quality of being the sole custodian, the quality of being the lineage itself, had transferred. She was now one of 2 people who held it. Then, as the student taught in turn, one of many. She sat in her practice room for a long time that morning, feeling the specific quality of what remained when the weight was no longer there. It was not emptiness. It was something she did not immediately have a word for. The best she could do, later, when a young woman practitioner asked her what the transmission had given her, was to say, "It gave me back the practice as a gift rather than a duty. For 12 years I practiced because I had to. After the transmission, I practiced because it was beautiful." This is the teaching from the mountain province of Kham. The thing you have been carrying, the weight that has organized your interior life around its requirements, the duty that became so continuous you forgot it was a duty, this has been carried by your strength for a long time. The carrying has been real. The thing carried has been real. But underneath the carrying, the practice was always also beautiful. The life was always also a gift. The strength that served the carrying was not the only thing you were. Tonight, the carrying can rest. Let the chest open slightly on the next breath, as though releasing something that has been held tightly enough to leave a faint impression even after the holding stops. The lineage is safe. The transmission continues. And as the morning light comes through Pema Yangchen's window in the eastern Tibetan plateau, and the practice opens back into something freely given rather than carefully guarded, we travel now eastward and forward 2 centuries to the river valleys of China, where a scholar worked without rest for 40 years and found, on the morning he stopped, what had been waiting for him the entire time. In the city of Nanjing, during the early years of the Ming dynasty, in the second half of the 14th century, there was a Buddhist scholar named Zongwen, who had been writing commentaries on the major sutras since the age of 22, and who, at 63, had produced a body of work that the monasteries and scholars of the period regarded as among the most precise and comprehensive doctrinal analysis of the era. He had a study that faced east, with a window that looked out over a small garden where a single plum tree grew near a stone basin that collected rainwater. He had worked at the desk in that study for 40 years. The desk surface was worn smooth where his writing arm rested. The cushion on his chair had been replaced twice. The inkstone had a groove in it from decades of grinding. He worked with the consistency of someone for whom work is not something separate from living. He did not experience the study as a place he went to when other things were finished. He experienced it as the place where everything that mattered happened, and the rest of his life as the intervals between the working. He ate simply. He slept adequately. He walked in the garden in the early morning for the sake of his back, which had developed the particular ache of someone who has spent decades in the forward lean of scholarship. He had students who came to him, and he received them with genuine attention, and when they left, he returned to the desk. He did not think of this as sacrifice. He had never wanted anything else. In his 63rd year, his eyes began to fail. Not catastrophically. The deterioration was gradual, the kind that scholars of his age and habits were familiar with. The characters in the texts he was reading became harder to distinguish from one another in the afternoon light. He began needing the lamp earlier and earlier in the day. He did not stop working. He adjusted. He worked in better light. He had a student read sections aloud to him and worked from the spoken text. He worked more slowly, more carefully, the economy of a person who can no longer afford to retrace and reconsider. He worked for 2 more years in this way. Then, in his 65th year, on a morning in the early spring when the plum tree was in the 2nd day of its bloom, he sat down at the desk and found that he could not begin. Not because of the eyes were what they were, something else. He sat at the desk and looked at the page in front of him, and the words that were supposed to come did not come. Not blocked, exactly, simply absent. As though the source of 40 years of continuous production had, without drama or announcement, simply emptied. He sat at the desk for the entire morning. Nothing came. He went to the garden in the afternoon and sat near the stone basin. The plum tree was very white against the gray sky. The water in the basin was still, reflecting the branches above it, and through the branches, the particular pale quality of an early spring sky in Nanjing, which has a quality different from the sky in other cities, a quality related to the specific humidity of the river valley and the particular angle of the spring light. He had walked past this garden 10,000 times. He had looked out at this plum tree through the window of his study for 40 years. He had not. He understood as he sat beside the stone basin on this afternoon in his 65th year, actually seen it. Not in 40 years. He had walked past it in the intervals between working. He had glanced at it from the window when his eyes needed a moment of distance. He had not sat beside it. He had not felt the specific quality of the spring air in the garden. He had not watched the reflection of the plum branches in the still water. He had not been in the garden except as a body passing through on its way to something else. He sat beside the stone basin for the rest of the afternoon. The scholar's students, when they came the following morning and found him again in the garden rather than at the desk, were concerned. He reassured them without explanation. He received their questions and their concerns and then returned to the garden. He sat in the garden for 7 days. On the 8th day, he returned to the desk. The words came back, different in quality from the words of the previous 40 years. Those who read the commentaries he wrote in the final years of his life describe them as more spacious, as though the writing had room in it for what it did not say, which the earlier work had not. He wrote for 12 more years, more slowly, in better light, with the plum tree visible from the window. What the scholars' 7 days in the garden offer is not the instruction to stop working. The work was real. The 40 years were real. The commentaries he produced were used in monasteries across China for generations. What the garden offers is this. The plum tree was there the entire time. The still water was there the entire time. The particular quality of the spring air in Nanjing was there the entire time. The life that the work was, in some sense, in service of, was present all along, waiting patiently in the garden outside the window, offering itself each morning to whoever had the stillness to receive it. You have been working. The work has been real, and outside the window of the working, also present, also waiting, is the life the working was always in service of. Tonight is the garden. Let the brush rest on the desk. Let your hands open now, wherever they rest, palms upward, fingers loose, the hands of someone who has set down the pen for the night and is simply present in the garden. And as the plum tree holds its reflection in the still water outside Zongwen's garden, we travel northward and eastward across the centuries, to the mountains of Korea, where a monk became so exhausted in practice that his body stopped cooperating, and received from that stopping the teaching he could not receive from the effort. In the Choson period of Korea, in the mountains of Gangwon province in the northeast, in the early 16th century, there was a Seon monastery called Woljongsa, the Temple of the Moon's Stillness, built in a valley of ancient fir trees whose lower trunks were wider than two men could circle with their arms, and whose upper branches, in late autumn, held the first snow while the valley floor was still bare. A monk named Hyokum had been practicing at Woljongsa since his early 20s. He was, at the time of this story, 41 years old. He had been practicing with the intensity that the Korean Son tradition calls great effort, the quality of practice that does not ease when practice ends, but carries into every activity of the day, into eating and walking and work and the brief hours of sleep. He had been practicing this way for nearly 20 years. The teachers of the Seon tradition speak about great effort with great respect, and also with a particular caution that is sometimes not heard by the student who is in the middle of the effort. The caution is this: great effort sustained without the counterweight of great rest will eventually teach its own lesson, though the lesson may arrive in a form the practitioner did not choose. In the winter of his 41st year, Hyokum's body stopped cooperating. Not dramatically. He did not collapse. He did not become dangerously ill. But he woke one morning and found that the energy that had sustained 20 years of great effort was simply not present. He sat to practice, and the quality of focus that he had maintained through thousands of sessions was, without explanation or warning, unavailable. He walked to the meditation hall and felt, in the legs and the back and the shoulders, a tiredness that was not the tiredness of a single night poorly slept. A deeper tiredness, the accumulated tiredness of 2 decades of effort that had not included adequate rest. He continued anyway, for the first 2 weeks. He sat in the meditation hall with the other monks. He kept the schedule. He applied the techniques of the tradition for generating energy and maintaining focus. The body was unimpressed. At the end of the 2nd week, his teacher, an older monk named Wolsan, who had watched Hyokum's practice with both admiration and concern for several years, came to him in the evening after the final sitting and told him simply, "Rest." Not rest and then return to practice, just rest. Hyokum was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "But the practice?" His teacher was also quiet for a moment. Then he said something that the community at Woljongsa preserved, because it was the kind of thing that stays, the kind of thing people repeat to each other years later when they are trying to explain something important. He said, "The practice has been resting inside you all along. The effort was to find it. Perhaps the effort has done its work." Hyokum rested for 3 months. He did not sit in the meditation hall. He walked in the fir forest in the mornings, slowly, without the deliberate quality of walking meditation, simply walking the way a person walks when they have nowhere particular to be. He slept longer than he had slept in 20 years. He ate what was offered without the monk's habit of eating only enough and no more. He sat in the courtyard in the afternoons and watched the light move across the stone floor without trying to use the watching for any purpose. In the 2nd month, something he had not expected began to happen. The practice arrived without his effort, not the formal structure of the practice, not the specific techniques of the Son tradition, something prior to the techniques. The quality of awareness that the techniques had been designed to develop, the quality that 20 years of effort had been aimed at, arrived on its own in the stillness of the resting. It arrived in the morning walks in the fir forest, where the particular quality of the winter light through the ancient branches produced a stillness that was identical in quality to the stillness the practice had been pointing toward. It arrived in the evenings in the courtyard, in the specific movement of the last light across the stone. It arrived in the simplest moments of the day, in the receiving of the morning meal, in the sound of the bell marking the hours, in the specific weight of the blanket at the beginning of sleep. He went to his teacher at the end of the 3rd month. He said, "I think I understand what you meant." His teacher looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "What do you understand?" Yokam thought about this carefully. Then he said, "I was carrying the practice the way you carry a lamp through a dark forest, holding it carefully, making sure it did not go out. And the practice was always the forest, not the lamp. The lamp was just what allowed me to see the forest in the dark. When I put the lamp down, the forest was still there. It had always been there." His teacher was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Yes. The teaching from the winter at Woljongsa is for anyone who has been practicing the way Hyokam practiced. Not necessarily formal meditation, but the practice of a life lived with great sustained effort, with the continuous holding of things together, with the quality of someone who has been carrying the lamp for so long they have forgotten the forest is real without it. The forest is real without it. Whatever you have been maintaining through your effort, the life, the relationships, the work, the holding together of what needs to be held, what you have been protecting and sustaining and ensuring does not go out, is also the forest. It is not only the lamp, and the forest does not require the lamp to continue being what it is. Tonight, set the lamp down. Let the eyes grow heavy behind the closed lids. Let the particular exhaustion of 20 years, or 2 years, or 2 months of great effort be exactly what it is, which is the tiredness of someone who has been fully present to a life that mattered. And as the winter light moves across the stone floor of Woljongsa's courtyard and Hyokam walks into the fir forest without a purpose, we travel southward and across the water to Sri Lanka, where a woman nursed her entire village through a long illness and found, in the stillness of her own collapse, the thing she had been too busy to receive. In the district of Kurunegala, in the central lowlands of Sri Lanka, in the early centuries of the Common Era, when the Theravada tradition had been established on the island for several generations, but was still in the period of becoming itself, of developing the specific forms through which it would be practiced and transmitted, there was a village near the base of a granite outcrop, whose name in the records of that period translates roughly as the place where the river bends. A laywoman named Sumeda lived in this village with her husband and her 3 children and the extended family that the structures of that time and place organized around a woman of her capacity and her reputation. She was known throughout the district as someone to go to when a thing needed doing, not as a teacher, not as a healer in the formal sense, simply as a person whose competence and whose willingness to apply it were so consistent that they had become the organizing fact of her community's practical life. In the second year of a long dry season, when the water in the village wells had dropped to levels that required careful management and the food supplies that the community had planned to last through to the next harvest were beginning to show the strain of rationing, an illness came through the village. It was the kind of illness that spreads quickly in conditions of heat and reduced water quality and close proximity, and which affects the very young and the very old with particular severity. Within 2 weeks, nearly every household in the village had someone who needed care. Sumeda organized the care. She did this the way she organized everything, systematically, practically, without drama. She identified who had the illness and who did not. She organized the households so that the healthy could support the ill without being themselves unnecessarily exposed. She managed the water supply. She prepared the remedies that the village's traditional knowledge provided. She sat through nights with families whose children were very ill. She received the bodies of those who did not survive and helped their families with what needed to be done. She did this for 6 weeks. She did not become ill herself until the illness had largely passed through the village, and the recovery of those who would recover was, for the most part, underway. On the morning of the 43rd day of her effort, she simply sat down in the entrance to her house and found she could not rise. Not the sitting down of someone who has decided to rest, the sitting down of someone whose legs have made the decision on their behalf. She sat in the entrance of her house in the early morning light, the village quiet around her, the granite outcrop visible above the tree line to the north, and she could not rise. She was not ill in the way the villagers had been ill. She was emptied. 43 days of continuous giving had reached the boundary of what her body and her will could sustain in combination, and the body had voted. She sat for what she later said was a long time, though she was not entirely certain, because in the state she was in, time had a quality different from its ordinary quality. The village was quiet. A bird called from somewhere in the trees near the water. The morning light, coming in at the low angle of an early hour, fell across the packed earth of the path in front of the house and touched the dust of it with the particular gold quality of very early tropical morning light, a quality that is present only for a short window and then lost as the sun rises, and the quality of the light changes to something harsher and more direct. She looked at the light on the path. She had walked this path 10,000 times. She had organized her life around the needs that walking it efficiently in service of others required. She had not. She understood, in this moment of involuntary stillness, simply looked at it. The light was very beautiful. Not beautiful in a way that required anything from her, not beautiful in the way of something that would lose its beauty if she did not attend to it. Simply beautiful in the way that light is beautiful when a person is still enough to receive it, present enough to allow the beauty to arrive without doing anything with it. She sat in the entrance of her house until the morning light changed and the village began to wake around her, and what arrived in her in that sitting was not a teaching in any formal sense. It was simply the specific experience of receiving what had always been present without the continuous interruption of effort. The light had been falling on this path every morning. The bird had been calling from those trees every morning. The granite outcrop had been there above the tree line every morning. She had been walking past all of it every morning, efficiently, purposefully, in service of what needed doing. On this morning, collapsed in her own doorway, she simply received it. Her husband found her there and brought her inside, and she slept for the better part of 3 days, waking to eat and drink and sleep again, which was what the body required. When she rose at the end of the 3 days, those who knew her said something was different in the quality of her presence. She was the same person. She continued to be the organizing center of her community's practical life for many more years. She continued to be the one people went to when a thing needed doing. But there was a quality in her that had not been there before the collapse. A quality of someone who knows, from direct experience, that the light falls on the path whether or not anyone is walking it efficiently. That the beauty is not contingent on the effort. That what is most essential about the life is present in the stillness as fully as in the doing, and does not require the doing to sustain it. You have been walking the path for a long time. The light has been falling on it the entire time. Tonight you have been brought to the doorway, willingly or not, and the body has its own wisdom about what it needs. Let the morning light be what it is. You do not need to do anything with it. Let the heaviness come now, the natural heaviness of a body that has given itself permission to stop, not the heaviness of defeat, the heaviness of someone sitting down in a doorway and finally, for the first time in a long time, simply looking at the light. And as the morning changes and Sumedha sleeps in the house behind the entrance where she sat, we come now to our last story tonight. Southward to Burma, where a very old abbot sat in his garden one evening unable to rise, and understood in that inability the nature of rest that all his years of teaching had pointed toward. In the Sagaling region of central Burma, in the late 18th century, in a period when the Theravada tradition in that region was in a period of quiet flourishing that the historians of Burmese Buddhism mark as one of its more productive periods of internal development, there was an abbot named Sayadaw U Nandia, who was, at the time of this story, 84 years old, and had been abbot of the same monastery for 52 of those years. He had entered the monastery at 18 and had never left it, except for the occasional journeys that the responsibilities of an abbot require. Journeys to attend the ordinations of monks at other monasteries, to receive the visits of teachers from other traditions, to participate in the assemblies that the Burmese Sangha convened periodically to address matters affecting the tradition as a whole. He had taught for 50 years. He had ordained hundreds of monks. He had overseen the construction of the main meditation hall and the renovation of the kitchen building and the establishment of a small library that housed, by the end of his tenure, more than 300 manuscripts on palm leaf and paper that monks and scholars came from other provinces to consult. He was a man whose life had been entirely in service of something larger than himself, and who had found in that service not sacrifice but satisfaction, not depletion but fulfillment, in the way that those whose work is genuinely aligned with their nature find the work generative rather than consuming. And yet, in his 84th year, in the early monsoon season when the rain came each afternoon with the particular force and completeness of tropical monsoon rain, so different from the tentative quality of rain in other climates, he was sitting in the garden in the evening after the rain had passed, as he sometimes did in the clear cool that follows the monsoon, and he found he could not rise. Not because of illness. He was not in pain. His body simply communicated, with the quiet authority of a body that has been patient for a very long time, that it was not going to rise just yet, that the garden and the evening and the specific quality of the air after the rain and the smell of the wet earth and the jasmine that grew against the garden wall were not things it was prepared to leave immediately. He sat in the garden. A young monk came to find him when he did not appear for the evening meal. The young monk was concerned. "Sayadaw," he said, "are you unwell? Should I bring help?" The old abbot looked at the young monk with an expression that those who later heard this story described as something between amusement and great tenderness. He said, "I am not unwell. I am sitting." The young monk stood uncertainly for a moment. "Is there anything you need?" The old abbot was quiet for a while, looking at the garden, the jasmine, the last light fading from the western sky above the monastery wall. Then he said, "I have been teaching people how to sit for 50 years. This evening, the garden is teaching me." He sat in the garden until the stars came out. Then, with the young monk's help, he rose slowly and went inside. He died 6 weeks later, peacefully, in his room, with the sound of the rain on the monastery roof, which was the sound that had been present throughout his adult life, and which was, in some sense, the sound of the tradition itself, continuous, patient, indifferent to the individual lives it rained down on, and entirely kind. What the old abbot's evening in the garden offers is very simple. He had spent 50 years teaching others how to arrive in the present moment. He had done this with genuine skill and genuine understanding. The teaching had been real. And on this evening in his 84th year, the garden taught him the same thing he had been teaching for 50 years, in the way that certain truths need to be received many times before they settle into the deepest place. The way rain settles into the earth differently in the monsoon than it does in dry season, reaching the roots that the surface moisture never quite reached. You do not need to do anything more tonight. You have been doing enough. You have been doing enough for a long time. The garden is here. The evening is here. The particular quality of this darkness in this room at this hour is here. None of it requires you to rise. We have traveled a long way tonight, to the Cedar Mountains of Japan, where an abbot held a monastery together for 31 years and learned in 10 days of rest what the 31 years of effort had been pointing toward. To the eastern Tibetan plateau, where a woman carried an entire lineage alone for 12 years and found, when she could finally set it down, that the practice had always been beautiful as well as necessary. To the gardens of Nanjing, where a scholar worked for 40 years and discovered in 7 days beside a plum tree the life the working had always been in service of. To the fir forests of Korea, where a monk's body refused the effort and gave him, in the refusal, the thing the effort had been reaching for. To the village doorway in Sri Lanka, where a woman who had held her community through 6 weeks of illness sat down and could not rise and saw, in the light on the path, what she had been walking past every morning. And to the jasmine garden in Burma, where an old abbot who had taught presence for 50 years sat still and let the garden teach him the same thing, one last time, in the wet air after the monsoon. 6 traditions, 8 centuries, 6 different forms of the same recognition. That you have been strong for a very long time. The strength has been real. What it served has been real. And underneath the strength, present the entire time, is something that does not require the strength to sustain it. The lamp can rest tonight. The forest is still there. Let the names dissolve now. Let the stories return to the silence they came from. The Japanese Cedar Mountains, the Tibetan Plateau, the Nanjing Garden, the Korean Fir Forest, the Sri Lankan Doorway, the Burmese Jasmine. What remains when the stories dissolve is what was always here. The breath, moving on its own, without your management. The body, held by whatever is beneath it, not requiring your effort to be held. The darkness, which is simply the darkness of this hour, patient and complete. You do not need to rise tonight. The garden will be there in the morning. The monastery will be there. The plum tree will bloom again. The forest will be the forest. For now, just this, just the breath arriving without your help. Just the body settling, heavy in the good way, the way a body settles when the permission to rest has finally been given, not by someone else, but from the inside. The strength you have been carrying was never the only thing you were. If sleep is reaching for you, let it come. You do not need to stay awake for any of this. The stories will find you wherever you are. Let go, not of anything important, of the effort to keep holding. The holding is done for tonight. What you have been holding is safe. Just this, just the body, resting, just the breath, moving, just this darkness, full of everything that does not require your strength to continue. Good night. I want to say something before you go. I make this channel because I believe that wisdom belongs to everyone, not only to those who have the energy to seek it. Tonight's stories were for the ones who are tired, for the ones who have been strong for so long they have forgotten what it feels like to simply rest. If these stories found something in you tonight, I am genuinely glad. Leave one word in the comments if you feel like it. Just one word for what tired means to you tonight. Someone will read it and feel less alone. And if the quiet Dharma is something you want to return to, the subscribe button is there. It costs nothing. It just means the next time a night like this one comes, this will be waiting. Sleep well. You have been strong enough for long enough. Good night.